6:14 in the morning. 200 feet beneath the Arabian Sea, an Iranian submarine releases a weapon. The USS Abraham Lincoln has no idea it is there. It has had no idea for 5 days. The formation has been running the same blockade enforcement patrol route since April 13th. Same speed, same turns, same intervals, same predictable geometry that any patient observer positioned below could chart with complete accuracy inside 48 hours and exploit with surgical precision inside 96. The submarine's commanding officer had needed all 5 days, not because the Abraham Lincoln was a difficult target to follow, but because the shot demanded patience far more than speed, and because the weapon he was preparing to fire had never been used in actual combat before, and he was not going to spend it on imperfect geometry. At 6:14, the geometry was perfect. What the Abraham Lincoln's crew did not know, what Lieutenant James Mercer had been attempting to communicate to them for 3 days, was that the submarine had been present since April 13th. That it had arrived the same morning the blockade went into effect, running silent at thermocline depth on battery power, following a transit route through the sonar coverage gaps in the formation that had been mapped before the ceasefire collapsed and rehearsed in simulation 14 times before the crew departed Bandar Abbas. That it had been receiving encrypted navigation burst transmissions from a shore installation every 6 hours to maintain positional accuracy without surfacing, and that every single one of those transmissions had been appearing on Mercer's passive sensor display since the morning of April 14th. Quiet, encrypted, present for 0.3 seconds every 6 hours, and then gone, from a position that had been moving slowly and deliberately toward the exact point beneath the Abraham Lincoln's keel that the submarine now occupied. Mercer filed his first report on April 14th at 11:23 in the morning. The response came back 2 hours later. The transmission had been assessed as consistent with commercial maritime navigation traffic. He was asked to continue monitoring. He filed his second report on April 15th with 24 additional hours of data attached. 4 transmissions logged, a position track demonstrating deliberate movement toward the Abraham Lincoln's patrol route, a projected intercept point placing the source directly beneath the carrier's position within 72 hours. The response came back the following morning. The assessment had been reviewed. The transmission pattern remained consistent with civilian maritime navigation. No further action required. Mercer looked at that response for a long time. Then he turned back to his display and kept watching. Because the transmission was not consistent with civilian maritime navigation, he had known that since the first detection. The only thing that had changed in 48 hours was that the source was now 40 miles closer to the point beneath the Abraham Lincoln's keel, where it was going to be when it fired. He calculated the intercept point at 1800 on April 16th. The source would be directly beneath the Abraham Lincoln's projected position in approximately 34 hours. That night he started building something, not a report, something more useful. The JASC-2 is Iran's submarine-launched ballistic missile, and it is not a torpedo. It does not travel through the water toward the ship. It leaves the launch tube at 200 feet of depth and accelerates upward through the water column, breaks the surface, and climbs. It is a ballistic missile that begins its flight underwater, and the difference between that and every other Iranian weapon the Abraham Lincoln had encountered across 48 days of war is not a technical distinction. It is the difference between a threat the formation's entire defensive geometry was built to handle and a threat it was never designed to face at all. Every Iranian missile in this war had come from land. Every radar coverage arc, every SM-6 assignment protocol, every intercept geometry the Aegis system had refined across 48 days of combat had been optimized for threats approaching from the horizon. The Spy-6 radar's minimum elevation angle, the lowest angle at which it can effectively track a climbing contact, creates a blind region directly overhead. A missile launching from 200 feet beneath the keel sits inside that blind region for the first 4,000 feet of its climb. The radar cannot see it. Nothing can see it. By the time the SPY-6 acquires the contact, it is already above the formation at 4,200 feet, climbing through Mach 3 and still accelerating. And the intercept geometry the Aegis system now has to construct is the worst possible geometry, a near-vertical overhead contact inside the engagement envelope that every fire control solution has always assumed contains no threat. Iran had studied Aegis coverage geometry for years. The JASC-2's vertical launch profile was not an accident. It was the answer to a specific question. How do you launch a ballistic missile in a way that presents the SM-6 with the worst possible intercept solution from the very first second? The answer was to launch from directly below. From the one position, the entire defensive system had never been pointed at. And while every defensive asset aboard the Abraham Lincoln and its escorts pivoted upward to engage the ballistic contact climbing overhead, the submarine beneath the keel would still be there. Still armed, still undetected by anyone except the lieutenant who had been watching its navigation burst transmissions for 3 days and building something nobody had asked him to build. Mercer's passive sensors acquired the launch at 6:14 and 8 seconds. Not through radar, through the electromagnetic pulse generated by the missile's ignition sequence transmitting upward through the water column. A pulse lasting 0.4 seconds that his system nearly logged as noise and that he recognized immediately, because he had been waiting for it for 18 hours. He picked up the circuit to the Combat Information Center at 6:14 and 11 seconds. "Sir, this is Mercer, Communications Intelligence. The navigation burst source I have been tracking for 3 days just produced a launch ignition pulse, bearing 182 directly beneath the keel. There is a submarine at that position, and it has just fired. I have a targeting solution on the submarine accurate to within 60 meters, and I need to transmit it to the helicopter right now." Tactical Action Officer Lieutenant Commander Hassan Owe looked at his tactical display. Clear. No contacts, no threats. The SPY-6 was showing nothing. He told Mercer the tactical picture was clear and asked him to stand by. The JASC-2 broke the surface at 6:14 and 19 seconds. The SPY-6 acquired it climbing through 4,200 feet at Mach 3 and still accelerating. Not from the horizon, from directly above the formation, already past the minimum elevation blind region, already transitioning from its vertical climb into its ballistic arc, already above and beyond the point where the SM-6 fire control geometry works cleanly. The Combat Information Center had 4 seconds of warning before the contact was at 40,000 feet. Owe had SM-6 assignment authorized in 6 seconds. 2 interceptors. The fire control solutions were marginal from the first calculation. Intercept probability 31% on Solution 1, 28% on Solution 2. Not because the Aegis system was malfunctioning, because the contact had launched from the one position that guaranteed the worst possible intercept geometry and was now climbing through an arc that the SM-6 was never designed to chase from directly below. Both SM-6s launched anyway, because 31% is not zero, and the JASC-2 was already at 60,000 feet. The first SM-6 reached its intercept point and found nothing. The JASC-2's near-vertical trajectory had carried it through the intercept point 0.4 seconds before the interceptor arrived. The second SM-6 detonated 140 meters from the missile's airframe, close enough to destroy one of its 4 stabilizer fins. Not close enough to kill it. The JASC-2 kept climbing, slightly destabilized, trajectory marginally disturbed, still climbing and still transitioning to its terminal ballistic arc toward the Abraham Lincoln's flight deck. 2 SM-6s expended, 1 missile still inbound, and the submarine beneath the keel had been monitoring the entire engagement on its passive sensors and understood that both interceptors had missed. At 6:15 and 44 seconds, the submarine fired 2 torpedoes, not from behind the carrier, not from alongside it. From directly beneath the keel at 800 meters, the same position it had occupied for 5 days, the position that made the torpedo geometry work and that made MH-60 Romeo helicopter prosecution impossible for as long as the submarine stayed there. 1 torpedo on the bow bearing, 1 on the stern bearing, both already running, both wire-guided, both receiving real-time position corrections from a submarine that could observe every movement the carrier made and transmit updated targeting coordinates down both wires within fractions of a second. The Abraham Lincoln had 58 seconds. Countermeasures deployed from the stern immediately. Acoustic decoys designed to pull incoming torpedoes away from the hull. Both torpedoes ignored them, not because the decoys failed, Because wire-guided torpedoes do not chase acoustic signatures. They chase coordinates. Coordinates being updated continuously by a submarine that could see the carrier and the decoys at the same time and distinguished between them without ambiguity. The carrier went to flank speed and hard to port at 6:15 and 51 seconds. The port turn displaced the hull 22 meters away from the bow torpedo's intercept geometry and 19 meters closer to the stern torpedo's path. The submarine corrected both wires within 1.4 seconds. Both torpedoes followed the adjustment, tightening exactly as the geometry had been designed to tighten. Every maneuver that helped against one torpedo made the other worse. The carrier's own speed and turning radius working against it, because both had been observed and calculated around for 5 days from directly below. 58 seconds became 41. 41 became 29. The MH-60 Romeo was airborne at 6:15, moving toward bearing 182, and could not drop. The submarine was still directly beneath the Abraham Lincoln's keel. Dropping a Mark 54 torpedo directly beneath a carrier placed the ship above it in danger. The helicopter needed the submarine to move. The submarine was not moving. It had fired from directly beneath the keel precisely because that position kept the helicopter blocked, and it was going to remain there until both torpedoes completed their runs. Because a submarine that moves before its torpedoes reach the target cuts its own guidance wires. 29 seconds became 18. The JASC-2 was in its terminal phase, descending at Mach 7 toward the flight deck, 2 torpedoes running from opposite directions beneath the hull. The helicopter blocked above a submarine it could not engage. 2 SM-6s gone. The Combat Information Center managing 3 simultaneous unsolvable problems with the resources available for one. OA looked at his display for 3 seconds, at the JASC-2 contact descending, at the 2 torpedo tracks converging from bow and stern, at the MH-60 Romeo holding position above a submarine it could not prosecute. Rear Admiral Carver picked up the all-hands circuit at 6:16 and 2 seconds. All hands brace for impact. Mercer heard those words and transmitted 2 things simultaneously. The first transmission went to the MH-60 Romeo helicopter. Not a search pattern, not an approximate bearing. A targeting solution accurate to within 60 meters on a submarine that had not moved in 5 days. Built from 3 days of navigation, burst position tracking and refined. Continuously since 6:14 and 8 seconds, when the launch ignition pulse had given him the exact firing position. The helicopter did not need to search. It went directly to the coordinates, displaced 400 meters south of the carrier's keel to clear the hull, and dropped both Mark 54s simultaneously at 6:16 and 9 seconds. The first Mark 54 acquired the submarine's acoustic signature in 2.3 seconds. A boat that had been running silent for 5 days had still been required to flood its torpedo tubes and activate its guidance systems to fire. Those sounds, quiet as they were, had been enough for Mercer's passive sensors to refine the position to within 60 meters. The torpedo found the pressure hull in 8 seconds and detonated. The second Mark 54 impacted 7 seconds after that. Both guidance wires cut simultaneously as the submarine systems failed. Both torpedoes committed to their last received coordinates in the same instant. Coordinates calculated for a carrier making 28 knots on a hard port, heading that the Abraham Lincoln had already departed during 19 seconds of emergency maneuvering since the last wire correction. The bow torpedo locked onto the position the carrier had occupied during the initial port turn. The stern torpedo locked onto the position from the secondary starboard reversal 11 seconds earlier. The carrier was at neither position. The bow torpedo struck the Arabian Sea 290 meters off the port bow at 6:16 and 31 seconds. The detonation sent a column of white water 260 feet into the air. The pressure wave reached the Abraham Lincoln's hull 0.4 seconds later and threw crew members off their feet in compartments 300 meters from the bow. The stern torpedo struck 310 meters off the starboard stern 4 seconds after the first. 2 heavyweight torpedo warheads detonating from opposite ends of a 333-meter ship. Pressure waves arriving from bow and stern nearly simultaneously. The ship flexing along its entire length between 2 opposing forces. 9 crew members injured. Equipment failed in 11 compartments. One forward compartment took on water through hull flex before damage control teams reached it. The JASC-2 was still descending. Mercer's second transmission had gone out at 6:16 and 9 seconds, the same moment he transmitted the submarine targeting solution to the helicopter. The JASC-2's guidance data link frequency, identified from the 0.4-second launch ignition pulse at 6:14 and 8 seconds, and confirmed by 62 seconds of continuous transmission data from the submarine's guidance console throughout the engagement. False position data on that frequency, the same spoofing architecture that had worked once before against a Shah 4, and that Mercer had been constructing since 6:14 and 11 seconds, running in parallel with everything else, because from the moment he identified the launch ignition pulse, he understood that the JASC-2 and the torpedoes were one attack, and both problems required one solution at the same time. The JASC-2 received the spoofed position data at 6:16 and 14 seconds, with 22 seconds remaining to impact. It corrected 800 meters to the left of the Abraham Lincoln's actual position, committing to a terminal trajectory aimed at open ocean. It struck the Arabian Sea 800 meters off the port bow at 6:16 and 36 seconds. The warhead detonated. The explosion was the largest the formation had witnessed in 48 days of war. A column of water rising 400 feet above the surface, visible from 30 miles away. A detonation that the Abraham Lincoln's crew felt through the hull on top of everything else they had already felt across the previous 25 seconds. Nothing penetrated the hull. In the Combat Information Center, the tactical display showed 3 destroyed contacts and a damage report that was still being compiled. Owe looked at it for 6 seconds. Then he picked up the circuit to Mercer's position. "Walk me through the timeline." Mercer looked at his display. At the navigation burst track he had been building since April 14th. At the targeting solution refined to 60 meters across 3 days. At the 2 transmissions sent simultaneously at 6:16 and 9 seconds, while the all-hands brace for impact order was still echoing through the ship. First navigation burst detected April 14th at 11:19, he said. Position track consistent with deliberate approach toward our patrol route. Launch ignition pulse at 6:14 and 8 seconds. Targeting solution was already built. Guidance frequency identified from the ignition pulse. Both transmissions sent simultaneously at 6:16 and 9 seconds. Owe was quiet for a moment. "Your second report was dated April 15th. "Yes, sir," Mercer said. The response came back April 16th. Neither of them said anything after that. The shore station that had been transmitting navigation bursts to the submarine every 6 hours since April 13th had generated 20 transmissions across that period. Mercer had logged everyone: position, timestamp, frequency, duration. 20 data points that together formed a complete picture of the submarine's transit route from Bandar Abbas through the formation's sonar coverage gaps to the firing position beneath the Abraham Lincoln's keel. That data, every waypoint, every depth change, every coverage gap the submarine had threaded, was transmitted to every anti-submarine asset in the theater by 7 that morning. The routes were now known, the techniques were compromised. Every sonar operator in the Arabian Sea had the specific acoustic profile of a submarine running silent on thermocline concealment, with a JASC-2 in its tubes, built from 5 days of passive observation and 62 seconds of engagement data. The shore station had been fixed to within 18 meters by the transmission triangulation Mercer had been running since April 14th. 8 BGM-109 Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from the Abraham Lincoln's vertical launch cells at 6:44. The station ceased to exist at 7:31. Iran had constructed an attack around the one geometric insight that 48 days of war had confirmed, that the Abraham Lincoln's entire defensive posture was pointed at the horizon and the sky, and that a weapon arriving from directly below created a defensive problem the formation had no answer for. A missile that climbed out of the water and became a ballistic threat before any radar could see it. 2 torpedoes fired simultaneously from the position that made every standard countermeasure worsen the geometry. An attack demanding 3 simultaneous solutions in opposing directions with the resources available for one. It failed because a lieutenant had been watching a 0.3-second encrypted transmission appear on his passive sensors every 6 hours for 3 days, and had built a targeting solution on a submarine that had not fired yet. And because when the moment came, he transmitted 2 things at once, and both of them worked. America's response destroyed the submarine, the shore station, and the only transit route Iran had ever successfully used to position a submarine beneath a carrier during an active blockade. And the lesson Tehran carried home from the Arabian Sea that morning was the one it least wanted to learn: that the most dangerous officer aboard the most powerful carrier in the world is not the one managing the intercept sequence. It is the one who noticed a 0.3-second transmission on April 14th and never stopped watching.